You are walking through a narrow valley, somewhere in what is now the Middle East, more than 100,000 years ago. The rock walls rise on either side of you, catching the last orange light of the day. You hear something moving through the brush ahead. Not an animal's gait. Something walking upright. Deliberate. Careful. You freeze. And then you see it. A face. Almost like yours. But not exactly. The brow is heavier. The nose is wider, built for cold air that never touches this valley. The eyes, though, the eyes are unmistakably curious, watching you the way you are watching them. This is not a monster. This is not quite an ancestor either. This is something in between, a cousin separated by hundreds of thousands of years, standing close enough to touch. What happens next in this moment has been debated by scientists for decades. And the answer, it turns out, is far stranger than anyone expected. A few years ago, a story went viral online. Ancient love letters, whispered romances between early humans and Neanderthals, entire relationships imagined out of a few strands of DNA. It was beautiful. It was moving. It also was not exactly what happened. The real story is not a single love story at all. It is not one dramatic meeting between two star-crossed hominins by a campfire. It is something much bigger, much longer, and, honestly, much weirder. A relationship that stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, in waves, across multiple continents. Involving generations of people who never once thought of themselves as separate species falling in love. So which is it? Was it romance? Was it conflict? Or was it something that does not fit neatly into either box? To answer that, we have to throw out the idea of one meeting entirely. For a long time, the assumption was simple. Modern humans left Africa around 75,000 years ago, ran into Neanderthals somewhere in Eurasia, and mixed with them once, briefly, before the Neanderthals faded away. New genetic research has completely upended that timeline. A team led by geneticists at Princeton University developed an advanced method for tracing ancient DNA called hybrid mix. What they found was remarkable. Contact between our species and Neanderthals did not happen once. It happened in at least 3 separate waves, spread across 250,000 years. Wave 1. Somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 years ago. Long before most modern humans had even left Africa. Before writing. Before agriculture. Before almost everything we associate with being human. Wave 2 came later. Roughly 100 to 120,000 years ago. This is the window that matters most for what comes next in this story, so hold on to that number. And then Wave 3. The one most people have actually heard of. Long assumed to have happened around 50,000 years ago. But the most precise recent estimate narrows it down further, to about 47,000 years ago. And here is the detail that changes everything. It did not happen in one moment. It unfolded steadily over a period of roughly 7,000 years. 7,000 years is a strange number to actually sit with. That is not a single encounter. That is longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. For most of the time our species has existed, we were, in some form, in contact with Neanderthals. And we are not just guessing at any of this from statistics on a screen. We have physical proof. In 1932, archaeologists digging in a cave on Mount Carmel, in what is now Israel, uncovered the skeleton of a child. She was somewhere between 3 and 5 years old when she died. For nearly a century, her skull confused researchers. The shape of it looked like ours, smooth curves typical of Homo sapiens. But her jaw did not match. Neither did the structure of her inner ear or the blood vessels running through her skull. Those features were Neanderthal. In 2025, a team from Tel Aviv University, led by Professor Israel Hershkovitz, used modern micro-CT scanning to study her remains in detail no one had access to before. Their conclusion: this child, known to researchers as Skull Eye, is the oldest known physical evidence of a Homo sapiens and Neanderthal hybrid. She lived roughly 140,000 years ago, right inside that second wave we asked you to remember a moment ago. She was not a rumor or a theory or a line of code in a genome. She was a real child with a real mixed body, buried by people who cared enough to bury her at all. So the question becomes obvious. If this was happening across such a vast stretch of time, where was it actually taking place? Researchers have spent years trying to pin down an actual location. In 2024, a team publishing in the journal Scientific Reports used ecological modeling, mapping out where the climate and terrain would have supported both species at the same time. Their answer pointed to one region above all others. The Zagros Mountains, a range stretching from southeastern Turkey down through Iraq and into Iran. The researchers described this area as a corridor, sitting right at the border of two very different ecological zones. Cooler, wetter terrain suited to Neanderthals moving south. Warmer, more open terrain suited to modern humans pushing north. It was not a battlefield. It was not a single dramatic crossing point either. It was more like a shared neighborhood, a landscape both groups moved through, hunted through, and settled in, for generation after generation. Other researchers have pointed to the wider Levant region as well, the stretch of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, as another likely zone of overlap. Picture it less like two armies meeting on a battlefield, and more like two extended families slowly moving into the same valley system over thousands of years. Occasionally running into each other at the same water source, the same hunting ground, the same cave shelter during a storm. Before we go further, I want to pause here for a second. If you are the kind of person who wants the real story, not the viral, oversimplified version, this channel exists for exactly that. We dig through the actual research, the actual papers, so you are not left with a comment section myth. If that is the kind of history you want in your feed, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Now, back to the story, because it is about to get more complicated. Because here is what the Zagros Mountains research and dozens of archaeological digs across Europe and the Middle East keep confirming. This was not a brief encounter. A major genetic study, published in December of 2024, analyzed 58 ancient human genomes alongside modern DNA. Their conclusion lines up with the archaeological record almost exactly. Modern humans and Neanderthals lived side by side, sharing overlapping territory, for somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 years. Not one chance encounter in a valley. Generations. Grandparents, parents, and children, growing up knowing the other group existed nearby. What would that have actually looked like, day to day? Almost certainly, competition. Both groups needed the same herds of animals, the same fresh water, the same caves for shelter during harsh winters. Resources were not infinite, and two different populations hunting the same valley would not have always gotten along. But competition was not the whole picture. The genetic evidence makes that clear. Interbreeding was not a one-time accident. It kept happening across the entire span of that overlap. Children were born who carried both lineages inside them. Some of those children grew up and had children of their own. Over thousands of years, the line between the two groups blurred more and more. Not because of one great romance, but because proximity, generation after generation, tends to do that to people. Now here is where the story stops being simple. If you looked only at the beginning of this story, you might assume it ends in some kind of merger. Two peoples becoming one, happily. The genetic data tells a harder truth. Researchers studying the genomes of both modern humans and Neanderthals have found something striking. Large sections of the Neanderthal DNA that entered our genome were not passed down evenly. Certain regions of our chromosomes carry almost no Neanderthal ancestry at all, in nearly every living person today. That is not random. That is the signature of natural selection, quietly at work over tens of thousands of years. Scientists studying an even earlier wave, the one that sent human DNA into Neanderthal populations around 250,000 years ago, found the same pattern working in reverse. Human genes that ended up inside Neanderthals were also selected against over time. The likely explanation is not romantic. It is biological. Hybrid children, in many cases, may have carried gene combinations that made survival, or reproduction, slightly harder. Not impossible. Just less favorable, generation after generation, in the long grinding math of evolution. So this was not simply a love story with a happy ending. It was messier than that. Genes flowed both directions, mixed, competed, and in many places, were quietly erased by the slow machinery of natural selection. The viral version of this story wanted a clean romance. What actually happened was something closer to two populations testing the limits of biology itself, not always successfully. And yet, despite all of that selection, some of it survived. Enough of it survived to still be sitting inside you right now. Here's the number that should genuinely stop you for a second. Scientists estimate that nearly every person alive today of non-African descent carries somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Not as a metaphor. Not as a fun fact for a trivia night. Actual, physical genetic material, inherited in an unbroken line, from a species that most people assume went completely extinct. Some of it shows up in surprising places. Genes linked to immune response, to skin and hair traits, even to how some people process pain or metabolize certain substances, trace back to that Neanderthal inheritance. Neanderthals did not vanish the way we picture extinction happening. There was no final battle, no last stand, no dramatic disappearance. Instead, over thousands of years of overlap, in the Zagros Mountains, in the Levant, later in Europe, they were slowly absorbed. Piece by piece, generation by generation, into the population that eventually became all of us. It is worth being honest here. Scientists are still debating the details. The exact locations of every contact zone. The precise number of interbreeding waves. Even how much of the selection against Neanderthal genes came down to real biological incompatibility versus simple chance. All of it is still actively studied and argued over in academic journals right now. This is not a closed case. It is one of the most active areas of research in human evolution today. New papers are reshaping this timeline every year, sometimes every few months. But one thing is no longer up for debate. This did happen. Repeatedly. Across a span of time longer than most of us can truly picture. So think back to that valley from the beginning of this video. The figure standing across from you, close enough to see the curiosity in their eyes. That was not a monster in the dark. That was, quite literally, family. Every time you look in the mirror, you are looking at walking, breathing evidence of an encounter that took place tens of thousands of years before writing, before agriculture, before anything we would recognize as civilization. The Neanderthals never really disappeared. They just became part of the story we are still writing. If you have ever taken a DNA test, you likely have a Neanderthal percentage sitting in your results right now, buried in a section most people scroll past. So tell me in the comments, have you checked yours? And if you had to guess right now, what percentage do you think is hiding inside your own DNA?